When the SUV pulled over at a sun-bleached gas station, surrounded by cracked asphalt and a crooked billboard that read, "Welcome to Sierra Springs," she got out. Just for a minute. Just to breathe. She didn't expect them to drive off. At first, she thought it was a joke, something stupid and petty, Carter trying to make a point in front of his entourage. He'd done that before, made her the punchline for a room of men in blazers. She waited 5 minutes, then 10, the heat pulsing through the soles of her shoes. Her phone had 1 bar of service, no signal strong enough to track a ride. She tried calling Carter. Voicemail. Again, straight to voicemail. Texts read but unanswered. She called Derek, one of Carter's campaign strategists. Blocked. Brett, same. One by one, each man in that car disappeared digitally, as surely as they had physically. Sloane stood motionless beneath the relentless New Mexico sun, her designer dress clinging to her back with sweat, the makeup she'd carefully applied that morning now melting down her face. A teenage clerk behind the gas station counter watched her through a smudged window, eyes flickering between concern and suspicion. The only sounds were the occasional buzz of a cicada and the low rumble of semis passing in the distance. Her suitcase, of course, was gone, tossed in the back of the Escalade like cargo. Her wallet had been easier to manage when Carter offered to carry it earlier that morning. The irony stung. A dust devil kicked up nearby, swirling hot air and grit into her face. She flinched. Her last $20 bill was crumpled in her phone case. She used it to buy a bottle of water and a pre-packaged sandwich that tasted like cardboard and regret. She sat on a bench in the thin sliver of shade beside the station, replaying the moment in her mind over and over. Carter slamming the car door, laughter erupting from the back seat, the taillights disappearing in the heat mirage. How had it come to this? She'd given up everything for him, her job at the PR firm, her apartment in Brooklyn, her independence. Carter had needed a partner who could support his rise, someone elegant, polished, silent when necessary. She'd played the part. She'd made herself small so he could shine, and now she was here, abandoned like a failed prop in the middle of the desert. The sun dipped lower, casting the town in a red-orange hue that made the gas station's rusted sign look almost surreal. Panic surged. Where would she sleep? What would she do when her phone died? She had no ID, no cash, no backup. Her parents were dead. The friends she once confided in had fallen away over the years, discouraged by Carter's cold charm and Sloane's increasing silence. She considered calling a rideshare, but nothing came up within 100 miles. Her last hope was a Greyhound station she spotted down the road, a flickering neon, "Open" sign in the window. She started walking. Her sandals, made for gallery openings in hotel lobbies, scraped awkwardly against the gravel. With each step, the absurdity faded, and something colder settled in. This wasn't a joke. This was intentional. Carter had left her on purpose. And that meant no one was coming. The Greyhound station was a lie, just a boarded-up building with broken windows and a sagging bench out front. Whatever promise that flickering "Open" sign once held had long since been swallowed by dust and time. Sloane stood in front of it, heart pounding, mouth dry, and stared at her reflection in the cracked glass. Smeared mascara, sunburned cheeks, and panic tightening her features into something unfamiliar. Her phone buzzed once in her hand. Low battery warning, then died completely. No signal, no power, no contact with the outside world. Carter hadn't just left her behind. He'd cut her off completely. She wandered aimlessly through the outskirts of the town, too proud to beg, but too desperate to pretend she was okay. No taxis, no buses, no hotels with vacancies or sympathy. A few people glanced at her as they passed, tourists in dusty pickup trucks, or retirees in wide-brimmed hats, but no one stopped. At one point she ducked into a roadside diner, more for the air conditioning than food. but left quickly when she realized she couldn't afford even a coffee. Her credit cards were in Carter's wallet. Her wedding ring, a platinum band he'd given her for their 5th anniversary, remained tucked in her bra. More security blanket than asset. By dusk, she was dizzy from hunger, her legs trembling from dehydration. She followed a gravel path that veered away from the main road, hoping to find a shaded place to sit, or at least somewhere out of view. What she found instead was the edge of town, the kind of place where civilization gave up and the desert took over. Just as her knees buckled and the world began to blur into a haze of heat and fear, she heard a voice. "Señorita!" Sloane turned her head weakly toward the sound. A woman stood at the end of the path. A short, older woman in a wide straw hat and denim apron, holding a basket of herbs. Her face was weathered but kind, her brown eyes sharp with concern. "You okay?" the woman asked, accent thick but words clear. When Sloane opened her mouth, only a whisper escaped. "I don't know." The woman didn't hesitate. She dropped her basket, walked to Sloane's side, and slipped an arm around her waist. "Come," she said softly. "You need shade. You need water." She helped Sloane to her feet, gently, steadily, and led her down a dusty side trail, past rusting wind chimes and adobe walls covered in vines, until they reached a small compound made of sun-bleached clay. The place looked like something out of a forgotten painting. Red earth floors, low walls, handmade pottery scattered across porch steps. Inside, it was cool and quiet, filled with the scent of dried sage and warm bread. The woman introduced herself as Mabel Ortiz, a local artist who'd lived there for decades. "This was my husband's land," she said as she poured water into a chipped glass and handed it to Sloane. "He's gone now. Just me and the birds." Sloane drank in silence, her throat raw. She tried to explain what happened, but the words got tangled in her chest. "My husband, he left me. I don't have anywhere to go." She hated how small her voice sounded. Mabel just nodded, as if none of it surprised her. "Then you stay here tonight. Tomorrow we see." No questions, no judgment, just calm, steady compassion. And, for the first time since the Escalade vanished down the highway, Sloane felt the tightness in her chest begin to loosen. She wasn't safe yet. She wasn't sure she'd ever be again. But for now, she wasn't alone. That night, sleep came in fits and starts. Sloane lay on a simple mattress covered with a handmade quilt, the sounds of the desert pressing in, crickets, shifting winds, the occasional bark of a distant coyote. The room Mabel offered her was small but clean, its adobe walls lined with old black and white photos and ceramic figurines. A faded fan hummed from the ceiling. Outside the window, the moon bathed the desert in silver, but inside Sloane's chest, darkness lingered. She clutched the pillow, mind spinning with thoughts of Carter, where he was, what lies he was spinning, and whether he'd even bother to look for her at all. By morning, her body ached from dehydration and restless sleep, but the smell of coffee and fresh bread pulled her from bed. In the kitchen, Mabel stood over a skillet, humming to herself as she flipped tortillas by hand. Sloane offered to help, unsure what she could do, but Mabel waved her off with a warm smile and pointed her to a plate. "Eat first, talk later." After breakfast, Sloane wandered outside to the edge of the compound. The view took her breath away. Wide open desert stretched in every direction, painted in gold and ochre under the rising sun. It should have made her feel small, but instead it offered something unexpected: clarity. She had nowhere to be, no one calling, no demands on her time or image. She was utterly alone, and somehow that realization brought with it a strange, trembling sense of possibility. Back inside, she found her phone and powered it on with the little juice it had left. The notifications lit up immediately. 13 missed calls from an unknown number, none from Carter. No texts, no apologies, just silence. She stared at the screen, thumb hovering over her father's number. One call and he'd wire her the money. One call and she could be on a flight back to New York by morning. Back to the life she knew. Back to a life where she played the perfect political wife, smiled at fundraisers, and dimmed her light so Carter's could shine. But that life had hollowed her out. She opened her wallet and pulled out her wedding ring. The platinum still gleamed in the morning light, but it felt cold in her hand. It wasn't a symbol of love anymore. It was currency. Sloane stared at it for a long time, then tucked it away and walked into town. She found a pawn shop with dusty windows and handed over the ring without a word. The clerk gave her $480 cash and a long, quiet look. She accepted both without flinching. Back at the compound, Mabel sat beneath a pergola trimming herbs. Sloane joined her and finally spoke. "I'm not going back," she said softly. Mabel didn't react with surprise or judgment. She simply nodded and handed Sloane a sprig of rosemary. It wasn't a declaration of war. It was a declaration of self. The days that followed unfolded slowly, like the desert itself, unyielding at first, then unexpectedly generous. Sloane found herself waking with the sun, the quiet mornings broken only by the call of doves and the rustling of wind through mesquite trees. Mabel didn't offer lectures or ask questions. Instead, she gave Sloane space to find her footing in this strange new rhythm. There were eggs to collect from the chicken coop, herbs to bundle and dry, and jars of chili jam to label for the weekly market. It was all so different from her life in Manhattan's gleaming high-rises, where every minute was scheduled and every smile strategic. Here, no one cared about appearances. They cared about the work, and the quiet honesty of doing it. Mabel introduced her to Mateo, her brother-in-law, a man with deep laugh lines, calloused hands, and a silence that spoke volumes. He ran a woodworking shop on the far edge of the compound, shaping tables, benches, and hand-carved spoons from desert cedar. When Sloane wandered by, curious, he handed her a sander and pointed to a stool leg in progress. No instructions, no formalities, just, "You try." Her first attempt was awkward, uneven. But he didn't correct her, he just handed her another. In town, Mabel took Sloane to meet Juniper, the owner of a local art co-op tucked inside a repurposed gas station. Juniper was vibrant, tattooed, and unapologetically direct, someone who had seen her own share of storms and come out louder for it. "We all ran from something," she said, passing Sloane a cup of prickly pear tea. "Doesn't matter where you came from. What matters is what you make next." Sloane began sketching again in the evenings, her fingers rediscovering a muscle memory she hadn't used in years. She filled notebooks with loose designs, product packaging ideas, herb label templates, market stall layouts. Mabel noticed, nodding in quiet approval. "Use your gift," she said one morning, placing a bundle of dried chilies on the table. "Make it part of this place." With their encouragement, Sloane started helping prepare items for the upcoming farmers market. Jars of Mabel's chili jam, bundles of smoked herbs, and a few handmade tea blends she'd concocted using local ingredients. She designed simple craft paper labels with hand-drawn symbols: sun, cactus, river. She didn't know if anyone would buy them, but for the first time in months, maybe years, she didn't care. The doing was enough. The making was the point. One evening, after dinner on the patio, Mabel looked across the table and said, "You're different than the woman who walked in here." Sloane looked down at her hands. Rougher now, a blister forming where her engagement ring used to sit. She smiled, small but real. "I feel different," she replied. The desert hadn't asked her to change. It had simply shown her what had been buried beneath the expectations and performances. And little by little she was beginning to reclaim it. As August unfolded in slow golden waves, Sloane found herself no longer counting days since Carter had left her. but measuring time in jars filled, shelves organized, and sunrises witnessed. What had begun as survival was becoming something deeper, a life not defined by who she'd been with, but by what she was building with her own two hands. Her confidence didn't return in a single moment. It arrived gradually, like the first breeze after a dry spell. It was in the way Mateo handed her tools without hesitation, in the way Mabel deferred to her opinion on a new label design, in the way Juniper leaned in when Sloane spoke. For the first time in years, her voice wasn't being directed, it was being heard. Every day brought a new challenge, and with it, a new layer of self-respect. She learned how to balance the co-op's books using an old laptop that wheezed when it booted up, helped Mateo fix a broken window pane in the chicken coop, and began experimenting with her own recipes. Infused salts, sun-dried tomato preserves, lavender chili rubs. The desert offered flavors she'd never tasted before, and her palate, once dulled by catered luncheons and corporate menus, was waking up. She started documenting her process in a sketchbook. Flavor combinations, packaging ideas, stories behind each blend. These weren't just products, they were pieces of the land, shaped by the people who lived on it, and, slowly, by her. Juniper took notice. "This is more than cute market stuff," she said one afternoon, thumbing through Sloane's sketches. "This could be a brand. Desert-made, woman-owned, all that good buzzword stuff, but real. You got something here." The words hit Sloane like a second sunrise. A brand. Her brand. Not Carter's vision or anyone else's campaign narrative. Just hers. They began working together in the evenings, preparing a small trial batch under the name Dust and Root, a nod to the desert's resilience and what it could still grow. Juniper handled the co-op licensing paperwork. Mabel offered her shed for prep space and insisted Sloane take full credit. "You do the work," she said, slicing cactus fruit with quiet pride. "Put your name on it." At the next Saturday market, Sloane stood behind a folding table layered with craft paper cloth and rows of hand-labeled jars. She was nervous, her hands shook. But then, someone tasted her chili lavender salt, smiled, and bought 2 jars. Then another came, and another. By noon, she had sold out of half her stock. It wasn't just the sales, it was the validation. A kind of truth Carter had always denied her. She could create something that mattered. She could succeed without permission. Later that night, Sloane sat under the stars with Mabel and Mateo, the desert wind curling around her like a quiet benediction. Her shoulders ached from lifting crates, her hands were speckled with dried chili oil, and her notebook was filled with new orders to prepare. She looked at the stars, and for the first time in a long while, the future didn't look terrifying. It looked wide open. The past didn't come crashing in. It arrived with the low hum of tires on gravel, a shiny black SUV rolling through the desert like a ghost from another life. Sloane was in the prep shed, sorting fresh chilies into baskets for her next market batch, when the sound froze her mid-mation. Through the dusty window, she saw the car stop just outside the compound gate. Her breath caught. She didn't need to see the plates. She knew only one person in her world would rent a vehicle that clean, that polished, to drive into the middle of nowhere. Carter Rhodes stepped out, looking wildly out of place in his designer sunglasses and pressed linen shirt, the same kind he used to wear to rooftop fundraisers in New York. He paused, scanning the yard, as if trying to understand what this place was, this life she had somehow built without him. When his eyes landed on her, there was a flicker of something almost human. Shock, maybe? But it passed quickly, replaced by that familiar smirk, the one that had once made her feel special, and now only made her feel cold. "Sloane," he said, arms spread slightly, like she might run to him. "There you are." She didn't move. She wiped her hands on a towel, stepped out into the heat, and stood her ground. "What are you doing here?" "I've come to bring you home," he said smoothly, like this was all just a misunderstanding. "This has gone on long enough. You've made your point." She laughed. Actually laughed. "My point?" He stepped closer, but she held up a hand. "Don't." He hesitated. "Sloane, come on. I know you're upset. I messed up, okay? Leaving you there, it was stupid. I was drunk. It was a bad joke. But this," he gestured around him, clearly struggling to assign value to what he saw, "this isn't who you are." "You don't know who I am," she said quietly. "I know the woman I married. And she doesn't live in the middle of nowhere selling spices at flea markets." "No," she said. "She doesn't, because that woman's gone." From the doorway of the main house, Mabel and Mateo appeared, silent and still. They didn't speak. Didn't need to. Their presence was enough. A quiet show of solidarity. Sloane reached into her pocket and pulled out a sealed envelope, holding it out like a gift. "These are divorce papers, already signed. You'll find provisions inside." Carter didn't take it at first. His face fell into something darker. "You'll regret this," he said, voice low and threatening. "I gave you everything." "No," she said, stepping closer. "You took everything, and I still made something of myself." When he finally snatched the envelope from her hand, it was as if a spell broke. He turned, climbed back into the car without another word, and drove off in a storm of dust. She didn't watch him go. She walked back into the shed, picked up a basket of chilies, and kept working. The day after Carter left for good, the sun rose as it always did, bold and unbothered, casting long golden rays across the red earth. But something in Sloane had shifted. Not subtly, not quietly. This time, the change roared beneath her skin like thunder. She wasn't hiding anymore. The confrontation hadn't just closed a chapter, it had sealed a door with steel bolts. She was no longer someone clinging to survival. She was someone building, intentionally, stubbornly, joyfully. That morning, Sloane walked to the town center with a folder tucked under her arm. Inside were finalized documents co-signed by Mabel and Mateo, a partnership agreement registering Dustin Root as a legal small business in the state of New Mexico. They had insisted she take a full 1/3 ownership. "Not charity," Mateo had said gruffly. "Payment. For what you've built with us." And Mabel, in her usual matter-of-fact tone, added, "You're family now. You've earned your place." She submitted the paperwork at the county clerk's office, then stopped by the co-op to reserve shelf space for her growing product line. Juniper grinned when she saw her. "You look dangerous today," she teased, "like a woman who knows what she wants." "I do," Sloane replied, surprising herself with how steady her voice was. "And I'm going to get it." Over the next few weeks, Sloane threw herself into the business like she had once thrown herself into Carter's image. But this time, it wasn't about branding someone else. It was about amplifying something real. She expanded the line with desert-infused body scrubs and fermented chili paste, each product rooted in recipes she'd developed under Mabel's watchful eye. She designed a small online store using the co-op's Wi-Fi and a borrowed laptop. Taking orders from nearby cities, she even began fielding inquiries from local boutiques who'd seen her jars on restaurant tables or heard about the woman who'd escaped her old life and started over with spices. Dustin Root wasn't just a business. It was a declaration. "I'm here. I'm capable. I belong." In the evenings, she still helped Mateo harvest mesquite pods or joined Mabel on the porch to sip tea under the stars. But the fear was gone. The silence was different now, no longer filled with grief or disbelief, but with presence, with peace. One afternoon, while organizing jars for the weekend market, Sloane caught her reflection in the shop window. Hair tied back, sun-kissed skin, hands stained with chili and earth. She barely recognized the woman staring back, not because she looked foreign, but because she finally looked real. She smiled at the reflection, and this time, it smiled back. Not with performance, but with power. 1 year later, the desert no longer felt foreign. It felt like home. The wind that once howled through the canyon now sounded like song. The heat no longer scorched, but warmed her skin like a secret kept by the earth. Sloane Harper, once a background figure in someone else's life, had become the centerpiece of her own. She stood behind her booth at the regional artisan fair, surrounded by shelves of dust and root products. Spice blends, pickled cactus, hand-poured desert sage candles. A banner fluttered above her in the warm breeze. Made with wild hands, in wild land. She'd written the slogan herself. Every word felt like truth. Customers approached her with questions, compliments, orders. A woman from Santa Fe had driven 3 hours just to meet her. A journalist requested an interview for a feature on female-run businesses in rural America. Sloane answered every inquiry with confidence but never over-explained. She'd learned that strength didn't need to shout. At home, Mabel and Mateo were waiting with dinner. Chili stew, mesquite bread, laughter echoing off adobe walls. Her evenings were simple, stories on the porch, work in the shed, sometimes just silence under the stars. But in that simplicity was a richness she had never found in the penthouses and parties of her old life. Her phone, once a symbol of stress and surveillance, now held new contacts. Juniper, Abe, other women from the co-op, local vendors, even an editor from a food magazine who'd become an unexpected pen pal. Her social media accounts remained dormant, frozen relics of another version of herself. She had no desire to scroll through the curated lives of people who once judged hers. There were still moments when Carter's voice echoed in her mind, when she passed a mirror and briefly expected to see the version of herself he'd approved of. But then she'd catch a glimpse of the woman she'd become, sun-browned, sharp-aged, deeply rooted, and remember, he hadn't just left her. He'd made space for her to rise. She kept the divorce papers filed neatly in a drawer, alongside a single photo of her former life. The two of them at a campaign fundraiser. Her smile so practiced, it almost looked real. She never looked at it for long. Just enough to remind herself how far she'd come. Sloane Harper hadn't just survived abandonment. She had bloomed in it. The story of Sloane Harper is a powerful reminder that sometimes the most painful moments in life are not endings, they're beginnings in disguise. When she was abandoned in the desert by the person who promised to love her, it could have shattered her. Instead, it revealed how strong, capable, and resourceful she truly was. Stripped of her status, possessions, and image, Sloane discovered her worth wasn't tied to any of those things. She learned that real freedom comes not from being rescued, but from reclaiming your own voice, your own path, and your own power. The desert, harsh and unforgiving, became the unexpected ground where she planted new roots. Not just in business, but in identity, purpose, and community. Through labor, creation, and connection, she rebuilt a life entirely her own. The lesson is clear. When someone tries to diminish you, walk away with nothing if you must, but know that nothing can be the space where everything is reborn. True strength isn't about what you endure for someone else. It's about what you become when you decide you deserve more. Sloane didn't just leave her old life. She outgrew it.